Andrei Chikatilo. The Soviet Union loved the idea of the teacher. It loved the image of a man at the front of a classroom, chalk dust on his fingers, authority in his voice, shaping children into citizens. In a system addicted to appearances, a teacher wasn't just employment. A teacher was a symbol. And symbols are dangerous, because symbols are trusted on sight. Andrei Chikatilo moved through that trust like a shadow that learned to imitate daylight. He was not the kind of predator that looks like a predator. He was the kind that looks like the person you would ask for directions. The kind you would let stand close to your child, because the world has already stamped him safe. His story begins long before the first body, in the parts of a life where shame hardens into something colder. Born in 1936 in Ukraine, in the era of hunger and fear, he grew up in a landscape that taught him the body is fragile and the state is indifferent. Family stories of famine, cruelty, and survival folded into him early, until empathy started to feel like a luxury. Childhood humiliations layered on top mockery, isolation, weakness, until he became a man who did not belong anywhere except inside his own resentment. And then came the private malfunction that would define his violence. Sexual impotence. Not just an inability in bed, but a wound to identity, a humiliation that doesn't heal in a culture that worships masculine certainty. For Chikatilo, it didn't produce softness or restraint. It produced a compensation. It produced a discovery that fear could replace intimacy, that domination could replace connection, that violence could become the switch that turned his body on. That is the first horror, and it's internal. The second horror is external. The system around him was built to deny the existence of certain monsters. Soviet ideology insisted serial killing was a capitalist sickness, not something that could rot inside the socialist paradise. Denial became policy. Investigations were pressured to find simple answers. Journalists were silenced. Statistics were managed. And when a killer is hunting in a system that refuses to admit a killer exists, the killer doesn't just operate. He thrives. The early murders around Rostov and its surrounding regions began to form a pattern that people could feel even when the state wouldn't name it. Runaways. Children. Young women on the margins. People who could vanish without shaking the center of society. Chikatilo's method of approach was ordinary, and that ordinariness was part of the weapon. A soft voice. A small offer. A promise of help. A shortcut. A treat. The point was not brute force. The point was to make the victim choose to follow, because that choice delays resistance. It buys seconds. And seconds are everything. The killings happened in the shelter belts, those strips of trees near rail lines and roads, spaces that are close to civilization but hidden enough to swallow a scream. His violence was extreme, not because he needed to kill, but because he needed the act to mean something inside his broken wiring. It was not sex in any human sense. It was a ritual of control, mutilation, and release. And when it was over, he could do the most terrifying thing a predator can do. He could go back to normal. Back to the station. Back to the bathroom sink. Back to a tie straightened in the mirror. Back to a wife and a domestic life that made him look like the world's safest kind of man, boring. The investigation, once the body count forced reality through the cracks of ideology, turned into a massive operation. Hundreds, then thousands, questioned. Patrols flooded transport hubs. Undercover officers watched faces like gamblers watching cards. But the hunt was crippled by the era's blind spots, shaky forensic science, bureaucratic silos, and the constant political pressure to close rather than to understand. At one point, Chikatilo was detained with items that should have set off alarms, and the system still let him go. A technical forensic assumption, treated like certainty, became the lock that kept the wrong door shut. That release is what makes his case feel like a national nightmare rather than a local tragedy. Because it wasn't only a killer hunting. It was a killer being granted time. Years of time. Time in which more people vanished into the trees. His eventual capture didn't arrive like a cinematic revelation. It arrived like the system finally exhausting itself into the right strategy. Saturation. Surveillance. Watching the transit points instead of chasing bodies after the fact. A patrol officer noticing a man stepping out of woods with the wrong kind of calm. A record check. A name resurfacing from old files. The slow click of pieces that should have clicked years earlier. Proving it was the final battle, because without modern DNA, the case leaned heavily on confession, on reconstruction, on the killer's own mouth becoming the evidence. And when the confession finally came, it didn't feel like remorse. It felt like a monster experiencing recognition, as if being named was its own kind of release. The trial became a public reckoning. Not just with Chikatilo, but with the illusion that a society can deny evil out of existence. The sentence and execution closed his life, but they did not close the scar. Because the legacy of a teacher who killed is not only the bodies. It is the theft of trust. It is the way a role designed to protect becomes a perfect disguise. It is the way an institution built on appearances can accidentally train itself to look away from the very thing it needs to see. Pamela Smart. A teacher doesn't need to be strong to be dangerous. A teacher only needs proximity, trust, and the ability to turn influence into a weapon. Pamela Smart understood that high school isn't just a building. It's an ecosystem of attention. It's a place where teenagers are starving for significance, where the right adult can feel like a doorway into adulthood, and where boundaries are supposed to exist precisely because the power imbalance is so absolute. In 1990, Smart worked at Winnacunnet High School in New Hampshire as a media coordinator, a young woman with the kind of polish that reads as competence and the kind of confidence that reads as gravity. She wasn't an old predator lurking in shadows. That's why the story hit so hard. She looked like the kind of person people let near kids without a second thought, because society teaches itself to trust certain roles by default. The case that followed did not become infamous because it was complicated. It became infamous because it was clean in its cruelty, and because the method was social rather than physical. The victim was her husband, Greg Smart, a man whose death would become the center point of an argument about seduction, manipulation, responsibility, and the question the public always asks when the villain isn't holding the gun: who really did it? The murder happened in their home. An invasion, but not by a faceless stranger. By teenagers. And that detail alone is enough to make a country recoil, because it forces the mind to picture something it doesn't want to picture: a teenage boy walking into a house with a weapon, believing he is doing something adult, something final, something that will rewrite his life the way movies promise it can. The early shape of the narrative tried to behave like so many others. A grieving wife. A senseless killing. Shock. Sympathy. The kind of public posture that depends on the assumption that the person crying at the center of the story is simply a victim of fate. But cases like this never stay on the surface for long, because teenagers are not built for silence. Teenagers leak. Teenagers brag. Teenagers panic. Teenagers implode under pressure because they don't have the mature architecture required to hold a secret shaped like a corpse. The investigation didn't need a miracle. It needed time. It needed interviews. It needed the inevitable fracture of a small circle that had tried to carry something too heavy. And when that fracture came, the story shifted from tragedy to conspiracy, from who did this to who made this feel possible. That's where Pamela Smart becomes the center of gravity. The state's theory wasn't that she physically committed the murder. The state's theory was that she created the conditions for it to happen, that she used an illicit relationship with a student to cultivate devotion, to feed a fantasy, to turn adolescent impulsiveness into adult-level violence. It's one thing when a teenager commits a spontaneous crime. It's another thing when the crime is framed as the endpoint of a narrative whispered repeatedly into a young mind, that murder is not horror, murder is solution. This is the part that made the case national. Because it wasn't only about a dead husband. It was about a breach in the moral wall around schools. It was about the fear that a teacher can become a recruiter. Not for college. For crime. The alleged dynamic was intoxicating in the way forbidden dynamics always are. An older woman, an authority figure, giving attention to a teenage boy. Attention that feels like validation. Validation that feels like love. Love that starts behaving like a contract. In these cases, sex is rarely just sex. It becomes currency. It becomes leverage. It becomes a way to test obedience, to measure loyalty, to separate the chosen from the unchosen. And the more the teenager invests, the more trapped he becomes by his own investment, because he has to keep proving he deserves the attention he's receiving. That is how manipulation scales. You start with secrecy. Then you add risk. Then you add the ultimate risk. The killing of Greg Smart was presented as that ultimate escalation, the point where the fantasy demanded blood to feel real. The boys who carried it out did not become monsters in a vacuum. In the public mind, they became the evidence of what happens when adolescent volatility meets adult influence in the worst way. When the case moved toward trial, it became a spectacle because it inverted a familiar cultural myth. The myth says teachers protect kids from bad influences. This story suggested the opposite, that the teacher could be the influence, and the students could be the instruments. The courtroom drama wasn't just legal. It was psychological. Teenagers took the stand. Deals and testimony drew a map of the relationship and the alleged planning. The prosecution's narrative aimed to show intent, persuasion, orchestration. The defense aimed to paint an adult woman being blamed for boys' choices, to raise the question of where manipulation ends and agency begins. And the public, watching, didn't really care about philosophical nuance. The public cared about the sickening image of an educator crossing the line and then, allegedly, turning the consequences into someone else's hands. That's why the term people used over and over was not merely affair. It was grooming. Because the act wasn't only sexual misconduct. It was the shaping of behavior, the shaping of loyalty, the shaping of a mindset where violence could be framed as devotion. The verdict sealed her legacy in true crime history. Conviction. A sentence that didn't just punish an individual. It broadcast a message about accountability for influence. And then the case became something else, a long-running cultural artifact. It was discussed like a morality play. It was adapted, referenced, debated, turned into a shorthand example of teacher-student exploitation with lethal fallout. But the most disturbing part isn't the media afterlife. It's the ripple it leaves behind in the real world. The ripple in how parents view schools. The ripple in how institutions tighten policies. The ripple in how communities realize that safeguarding is not about catching obvious monsters. It's about understanding that the most dangerous violations often begin looking like intimacy, like favoritism, like special attention, like a private bond that teenagers interpret as love and adults understand as control. Pamela Smart's case remains infamous because it sits at the crossroads of three American anxieties: the fear of corrupted authority, the fear of adolescent violence, and the fear that people can be convinced to do the unthinkable if the right person whispers the right story into their ear long enough. It wasn't a case about a masked intruder. It was a case about influence becoming a blade. It was a case about the classroom's power extending far beyond the school walls, into a living room where a man died because someone allegedly decided that a marriage could be ended the way a problem is ended, not with separation, not with divorce, but with a gun in the hands of a boy who was still learning what consequences mean. Nancy Seaman. Some teacher killer stories are loud from the start. A gunshot. A chase. A headline that arrives already screaming. This one was quieter, which is exactly why it unsettled people who followed it closely. Because the quiet cases are the ones that force you to confront a different kind of horror, the horror of a person who understands how to perform normal, how to build a believable scene, how to stand in front of authority and speak in the calm cadence of someone who has spent a lifetime managing classrooms, parents, and administrators. Nancy Seaman wasn't a stranger drifting through a city. She was a familiar type. A former teacher. A former principal. A woman associated with structure, discipline, the orderly rituals of responsibility. The kind of person the world tends to file under safe, because we like our educators to feel like guardrails. And then her husband, Robert Seaman, was found dead in their home, and the guardrails snapped. The initial story was the kind of story communities want to accept because it keeps the moral map clean: an intruder, a burglary, violence from outside the household. The home remains the victim. The couple remains us. The danger remains them. That narrative is comforting, and comfort is exactly what a staged story feeds on. A spouse found dead. A frantic report. A description of chaos. The implication that something evil came in from the dark and left. But investigations don't live on implication. They live on friction. They live on the small details that refuse to match the big story. Detectives started doing what detectives always do when something feels rehearsed. They slowed the scene down. They measured it. They asked why certain things were where they were. They asked what was disturbed and what was curiously untouched. They looked at what was missing, and what a burglary should have taken but didn't. They listened to the account, then listened again, not for emotion, but for structure, because fabricated stories often have a certain smoothness, a certain over-explained rhythm that real panic rarely produces. The physical evidence began to speak in a language that didn't align with the intruder myth. The violence itself suggested intimacy. Not romance. Proximity. The kind of proximity that implies the attacker didn't need to search for the victim, didn't need to navigate the home like a stranger, didn't need to risk discovery the way an outsider would. And then there was the housekeeping of the scene, the subtle sense that someone had tried to arrange reality into something more convenient. When police began to pull at those threads, the case shifted from tragic break-in to domestic homicide wearing a mask. That shift is always brutal, because it forces a community to stop looking outward for danger and start looking inward at the person still standing in the house, the person telling the story, the person who has a reason to want the narrative to stay simple. In court, the fight became less about whether Robert Seaman was dead. Everyone agreed on death, and more about how truth can be shaped by someone who knows how to control a room. Because teaching is, in many ways, controlled storytelling. You manage attention. You manage behavior. You manage the sequence of what people learn and when they learn it. And prosecutors argued that the same skill set had been repurposed here, to manage perception, to manage suspicion, to keep the spotlight pointed at an imaginary intruder while the real explanation sat closer to home. The defense tried to keep the original comfort alive: an unknown killer, a tragedy, a woman caught in a nightmare. But the state leaned on the stubbornness of physical facts. Injuries don't negotiate. Blood doesn't improvise. The home doesn't lie unless a person inside it rearranges the truth. And as the case progressed, the story stopped feeling like a mystery and started feeling like a demonstration of how domestic violence can be disguised when the person accused has social credibility. Nancy Seaman was ultimately convicted, and the conviction landed like a warning label on an entire category of trust. Because the legacy of her case isn't only the death of one man. It's the way it teaches the public to fear the performance. The tidy explanation. The calm voice. The believable grief. The case sits in the teacher-killer canon because it doesn't rely on the trope of a predator stalking students. It relies on something more unsettling: the idea that someone trained to lead, to supervise, to uphold rules can allegedly commit the worst violation in private and then try to grade the world's reaction like an exam, confident she knows which answers will sound correct. The system's job, in the end, was to refuse the easy narrative and insist on the harder one. And the harder one, in cases like this, always has the same bitter aftertaste. Sometimes the most dangerous person in the house is the one who seems most capable of explaining what happened. Alan Haw. There is a particular kind of horror reserved for the man everyone calls steady. The educator. The deputy principal. The person who speaks in measured tones at meetings, who looks like routine made flesh, who seems built for responsibility the way a building is built for weather. Alan Haw fit that shape. He lived in rural Ireland, in the kind of community where reputations are currency and familiarity is supposed to be safety. He was known as a teacher and a deputy headmaster, a father of 3, a man with a public life that looked disciplined. That's what made the case land like a sinkhole. Because the crime did not arrive as a mystery. It arrived as an erasure. In 2016, Haw's wife, Clodagh, and their 3 young sons were found dead in their home, and Haw was dead as well. The official narrative would eventually describe it as a murder-suicide. But murder-suicide is a label that can sound neat, almost administrative, like the state trying to fold catastrophe into a file. The reality beneath it is not neat. It is domestic annihilation. It is a man deciding that if he cannot control the story of his life, then no one in the house gets to continue theirs. The scene itself carried the cold signature of deliberateness, the kind of deliberateness that frightens people more than chaos. Because chaos can be imagined as a moment. Deliberateness implies time. It implies choices made in sequence, each choice stepping past the last chance to stop. Investigators had to reconstruct not just what happened, but the pressure system that might have made the steady man rupture. The case became saturated with the kinds of explanations communities reach for when they need to protect their own sense of order: stress, debt, fear of exposure, private shame. The details that surfaced in public discussion suggested financial strain and the weight of secrets, the kind of hidden stressors that can turn a household into a sealed container. But the most disturbing element wasn't any single motive. It was the pattern the case belongs to, the family annihilator pattern, where the killer frames murder as a solution to a crisis that exists mostly in his own mind. In that pattern, the children are not seen as separate human beings with futures. They are seen as extensions. They are seen as collateral. They are seen as parts of a life the killer believes he owns. And when that belief collapses, the violence becomes total. The investigative and inquest process that followed had to navigate two brutal tasks at once. The first was practical: confirm sequence, method, and cause, because the state cannot record even the most obvious horror without evidence. The second was cultural: confront the fact that someone entrusted with children at school could destroy children at home. That is why this belongs in Teachers Who Kill. Not because he preyed on students. Because he embodies the betrayal of the caretaker role in its most extreme form. He wasn't just a man who taught children. He was a man who lived inside the social assumption that educators are safe. And then, in one morning, the assumption was burned into ash. The aftermath is what makes this kind of case poison. A community doesn't only mourn the dead. It mourns the reality it thought it lived in. Colleagues, parents, neighbors, everyone begins to replay every interaction, looking for cracks they missed, signs that were there but too quiet to register. And the family left behind, extended relatives, grandparents, friends, are forced to live with the worst kind of unanswered question, the question that doesn't have a satisfying answer because it isn't logical in the way normal life is logical. Why would a father do this to his own children? In cases like Hawes, the system can close the file with a conclusion, but it cannot close the wound. Because the true damage isn't only the loss of 4 lives. It's the way a crime like this infects the concept of home and trusted professional at the same time. It leaves behind a legacy that is quieter than headlines but heavier than them, the understanding that stability can be a performance, and that sometimes the most terrifying violence isn't committed by someone who looks like a monster. It's committed by someone who looks like the person you would trust with your child's future. Reese Hancock. A head teacher is supposed to be the adult who keeps chaos out. The person who manages conflict, who speaks in the language of safeguarding and responsibility, who stands at assemblies and tells students that actions have consequences. Reese Hancock stood in that role. He was a school leader in Wales, a man whose job was literally to embody control. And that is why his case felt like a betrayal with a blade in it, because when someone like that kills, the public doesn't just see murder. The public sees the collapse of an authority figure into the very thing he was paid to prevent. The story doesn't begin with his title. It begins with intimacy turning toxic, with jealousy hardening into possession, with a private life that could not tolerate the idea of being ordinary. In 2018, Hancock killed his wife, Helen, and a man named Martin Evans. The crime was rooted in relationship dynamics, fear of abandonment, rage at perceived betrayal, the kind of emotional logic that turns love into ownership. But what made it nationally chilling was the way it revealed that the skills of a leader, planning, compartmentalizing, presenting a calm front, can coexist with a capacity for sudden, annihilating violence. The investigation unfolded with the grim efficiency these cases demand. Police didn't have the luxury of treating it as a distant puzzle. 2 bodies. A domestic context. A community instantly on fire with rumors and shock. The case moved quickly toward the central figure because the circle of who could have done it was not infinite. And once the suspicion locked in, the story became less about who and more about how could someone like him. That question is always the public's real obsession. Because the public wants violence to be legible. The public wants the killer to look like the kind of person you would cross the street to avoid. Hancock didn't fit that need. He fit the opposite. He fit the kind of person parents shake hands with, the kind of person staff respect, the kind of person who can smile in a corridor and be believed. In court, the narrative hardened. Evidence, timelines, motive, the brutal fact of choice. The case was not a foggy mystery about an unknown intruder. It was a mirror held up to a very specific terror, that the person who can manage a school can also manage a double life of resentment, and then explode it outward. The trial stripped away any remaining comfort. A head teacher, a role built on protecting young people, was being judged for destroying lives in his own circle. The outcome, conviction and a life sentence, gave the public the formal closure it demands. But formal closure does not repair moral damage. Because the ripple from this kind of case spreads through institutions in a quiet, corrosive way. Teachers wonder what colleagues they truly know. Parents wonder how well schools can judge character when the adults at the top can fracture so completely. Students, even if they don't fully understand the details, absorb the atmosphere, that authority is not purity, that titles do not guarantee safety, that the adult world can be more unstable than the child world it claims to guide. And at the center of that ripple is the simplest, ugliest legacy of the Hancock case. It confirms a truth that is hard to say without sounding paranoid. Some killers don't hide from society. They hide inside its most trusted roles. Myung Jae-won. The most terrifying teacher-killer cases aren't the ones that happen in the woods or on lonely roads. They are the ones that happen inside the perimeter we tell ourselves is safe. A school is not just a building. It is a promise. It is the place parents hand their children to the state for several hours a day and trust that the state will return them alive. That trust is so fundamental that most people don't even feel it. They live on it unconsciously. They walk through their day believing the classroom is an island where the worst parts of the world are kept out by rules, by oversight, by the idea that adults in schools are vetted, trained, stable. This case shattered that island. It forced the public to imagine a nightmare that has no comfortable defense. A teacher, in the very space designed for learning and protection, allegedly turning that space into a crime scene. The name Myung Jae-won entered the story with the kind of cold shock that spreads beyond borders, because the core fear is universal. If it can happen there, it can happen anywhere. The early reporting described a school environment where the killer wasn't a stranger breaking in. He was already inside. He belonged to the institution. That is what makes the crime feel like a betrayal rather than an attack. It reframes the threat as something embedded, something that doesn't need to sneak past security because it carries the keys. The investigation in such cases becomes an emergency dissection of trust. Police don't only have to establish facts. They have to establish how the facts were allowed to occur. Who saw what? Who missed what? What procedures existed? What warning signs were present? Because when the setting is a school, the public doesn't accept "we didn't know" as easily. The public hears "we didn't know" as "we didn't look." The victim, a student, becomes more than an individual tragedy. The victim becomes an accusation. A silent question pointed at every adult who worked in that building: where was the protection when it mattered? In courtrooms and press conferences, cases like this often drag mental health and institutional oversight into the same sentence, because people desperately need an explanation that doesn't feel like pure randomness. They want to know whether the offender showed instability, whether colleagues noticed changes, whether there were prior incidents, whether the system had any chance to intervene before it became irreversible. But the system, even at its best, struggles with the one reality these cases expose. You can regulate behavior. You can run background checks. You can install cameras. You cannot fully predict when a person's internal world will collapse into violence. And that uncertainty is what turns a school-based killing into national trauma. It corrupts a space that relies on psychological innocence. The aftermath is always larger than the courtroom. Parents become hypervigilant. Teachers become suspected by proximity to a crime they didn't commit. Students absorb the fear and carry it into adulthood as a quiet distrust of institutions. The school itself becomes a haunted location, not in the supernatural sense, but in the social sense. A place where the memory of the breach never fully leaves, no matter how many years pass or how many coats of paint are added. This is why this case belongs in a top 10 of teacher killers. Not because it is the most complex. Because it attacks the one assumption society cannot function without, that children are safe at school. When that assumption breaks, the whole structure of daily life wobbles. And people begin to realize, in the most brutal way, that safety is not a natural condition. Safety is a system. And systems can fail. Kathleen Dorsett. The most unsettling teacher killer cases aren't always the ones that happen with a weapon in hand. Sometimes the horror is administrative. Sometimes the horror is outsourced. Sometimes the horror is a person trained to manage classrooms deciding to manage a human life the same way, by planning, delegating, and treating consequences like something that can be graded later. Kathleen Dorsett was a schoolteacher in New Jersey, and the case that made her infamous didn't look like a sudden explosion of rage. It looked like a decision that aged into a plot. The target was her ex-husband, Stephen Moore, a man who should have been protected by the most basic assumption of modern life, that divorce ends a relationship, not a life. But this story didn't follow the clean line people want. It followed the crooked line of resentment, control, and the kind of entitlement that can't tolerate being told no. In 2010, Moore was shot outside his home in what initially looked like a robbery or a street crime, the kind of violence that police can file under the city's background noise. That first impression is important, because it's exactly how a planned killing survives its early hours. It hides under familiarity. It borrows the shape of random crime so no one looks too hard at the people closest to the victim. But investigations don't stay on first impressions forever. They move like pressure. They revisit. They re-ask. They follow the money, the relationships, the grudges that don't show up in the first report but always exist in the second interview. And as the case tightened, the narrative shifted from unknown shooter to something colder, a murder plot tied to the victim's former wife, with her parents implicated as part of the machinery behind it. That's what made it blow up in the public mind. Not just a teacher accused of murder, but a family system accused of turning homicide into a group project. The courtroom phase carried the specific ugliness of conspiracy cases, because conspiracy drags the moral stain across multiple people. You're no longer asking, who pulled the trigger? You're asking, who decided a man should die, and who helped make that decision real? Prosecutors painted a structure: planning, coordination, recruitment, the idea that the killing wasn't a moment, it was a plan that lived in people's heads long enough to become action. The defense tried to break that structure apart, to isolate responsibility, to make the story smaller and less organized. But the jury's conclusion gave the public the line it needed to draw: guilty. And when the sentence came, the case crystallized into a warning about respectability. Because a teacher's public identity is built on trust, and trust is exactly what makes a plot like this feel extra poisonous. It suggests the person can perform responsibility in daylight while arranging ruin in private. The aftermath didn't just live with Moore's family. It lived with every parent who heard schoolteacher and realized how little that word guarantees about character. It lived with the cold realization that some killers don't snap. Some killers schedule. Maria Seifert. There are teacher killer cases that feel like heat. Rage, noise, a sudden eruption. This one felt like ice. It felt like a plan that could sit quietly in a person's mind while the world around her continued to behave normally. Maria Seifert was a teacher in Wisconsin, a professional identity that carries a built-in assumption of stability, and that assumption became part of the camouflage. She wasn't accused of a spontaneous act. She was accused of arranging the death of her husband, John Seifert, by hiring someone else to do it. That detail matters, because it changes the flavor of the violence. Hiring a killer is not a momentary loss of control. It's premeditation with paperwork. It's cruelty filtered through deliberation. It's the decision to turn murder into a transaction. The killing itself happened in 2010, on a day that should have been ordinary. John Seifert was shot outside his home. At first glance it could be framed as random violence, a stranger, a robbery, the kind of explanation people cling to because it keeps the terror external. But the case didn't stay external. Investigators did what they always do when random doesn't sit right. They looked for motive that lives close to the victim, because most murders do. They looked at relationships, money, resentments, and the fractures in a marriage that outsiders rarely see until the worst outcome drags them into the open. A hired killing plot has a particular investigative footprint. It requires contact. It requires communication. It requires money moving in ways that don't match normal life. It requires someone on the outside who can be traced back. And once police begin to identify the shooter and pull at that thread, the thread tends to lead to the same place, the person who benefits most from the death. In Seifert's case, the narrative prosecutors presented was that she sought a way out that did not involve leaving, that she wanted the freedom of widowhood without the mess of divorce, and that she believed distance, having someone else pull the trigger, would also create distance from consequence. The trial became a cold autopsy of intention. Not just what happened, but what was decided beforehand. Jurors were asked to see beyond the surface of the profession, beyond the idea of a teacher as inherently nurturing, and look at the alleged machinery behind the crime: planning, recruitment, the deliberate choice to outsource violence. The verdict and sentence carried a different kind of shock than a sudden domestic shooting, because it confirmed a fear that sits under many true crime stories: some people don't kill in a rage. Some people kill as a solution. They treat a human life like an obstacle that can be removed with the right arrangement, the right phone calls, the right amount of money. The aftermath is what keeps the case lodged in the public mind. A spouse dead in the driveway. Children and family left to reconstruct a marriage they thought they understood. A community forced to reconcile the image of an educator with the idea of orchestration and betrayal. Because when a teacher is accused of commissioning murder, the damage extends beyond one household. It stains the role itself. It tells the world that the most unsettling violence doesn't always come from a stranger's hand. Sometimes it comes from the person who shares your bed, delivered not with fury, but with a plan. Carla Hughes. Some teacher killer cases start with blood on a floor. This one started with a phone call no one can ever unhear again. A young pregnant woman vanishes, and the people who love her begin to learn the most brutal lesson in modern true crime: sometimes the person who wants you gone doesn't hate you. Sometimes they just want your life. Carla Hughes was a middle school teacher in Mississippi, a job that automatically paints someone in softer colors. Teacher. Educator. Community member. A person who stands in front of children and talks about choices. And yet the case that swallowed her name into infamy wasn't about a momentary snap. It was about obsession turning into entitlement, and entitlement turning into a plan. The victim was Avis Banks, a pregnant woman engaged to the man Hughes wanted for herself. That's the simple shape of the motive, and it's terrifying because it's so common in its emotional logic. A love triangle. A private rivalry. The belief that another person is in the way. But what makes this case disturbingly memorable is that it wasn't framed as a spontaneous confrontation. It was framed as a removal. A deletion. A woman and her unborn child treated like obstacles to a preferred future. When police began working the disappearance, the investigation had to do what these investigations always do: take the emotional chaos and reduce it into timelines and points of contact. Who saw her last? Where her phone went quiet? What stories changed when repeated? What relationships sat close enough to have motive? The pressure built not because detectives had a cinematic breakthrough, but because human secrets don't stay stable under scrutiny. A missing pregnant woman attracts gravity. Every lie becomes heavier. Every inconsistency becomes louder. As the case tightened, the narrative turned toward the relationship behind it, toward the jealousy that doesn't look dangerous until it becomes action. Prosecutors built their theory around intent and planning, the idea that this wasn't a tragedy that happened to a family. It was a tragedy arranged for them. And in court, the distinction mattered. Juries can sometimes understand rage. They can sometimes imagine an argument going wrong. But premeditation changes the temperature of a case. Premeditation feels like ice. It suggests the killer had time to stop and still kept going. It suggests the killer chose the outcome before the victim ever knew she was in danger. The trial became the place where the teacher mask was forced off under fluorescent light. The state argued that Carla Hughes didn't merely dislike a rival. She wanted to replace her. She wanted the man. She wanted the future. And she was willing to take it by force. The verdict landed with the kind of blunt finality the public craves in cases involving a pregnant victim, because it allows the country to say, at least legally, that the unborn counted, that the loss was doubled, that the crime was not just against a woman but against a future that never got to start. Carla Hughes was convicted and sentenced to life without parole, and the sentence itself became part of the moral punctuation of the story. No second act. No redemption arc. No learning from mistakes. Just a hard ending, because the harm was permanent. The aftermath is what keeps this case inside the teacher-killer canon. Not because the crime happened at a school, but because the offender's public identity was built on trust, and trust is what makes obsession so dangerous when it lives behind a respectable face. It leaves behind a chilling takeaway that doesn't feel like a lesson. It feels like a warning. Some predators don't look like predators. Some predators look like the adult you'd expect to be safe. And sometimes the most disturbing murders aren't about rage at all. They're about a person calmly deciding that someone else's life is negotiable. Carolyn Warmus. Some teacher-killer cases don't begin with violence. They begin with an obsession that grows teeth. They begin with a woman who learns to live two lives at once, one life in daylight, where she is competent, polite, appropriate, the kind of adult you trust around children. And another life in the dark, where desire becomes entitlement, where jealousy becomes a doctrine, where the only acceptable ending is the ending she writes herself. Carolyn Warmus was an elementary school teacher in New York. She wasn't presented to the world as a predator. She was presented as ordinary. That is always the first protection. Ordinary is a curtain people don't look behind. The case that made her infamous revolved around a married man she was involved with and the woman standing between Warmus and the life she believed she deserved. The victim was the wife. The home became the stage. And the crime, cold, targeted, intimate, landed like a message. This wasn't random, this was personal. The investigation unfolded with the grim logic that governs love triangle murders. Police don't start with strangers. They start with proximity. They start with who benefits. They start with who had motive strong enough to turn affection into a weapon. Warmus didn't fit the public's preferred villain profile. That detail mattered, because it slows suspicion. It buys time. It gives the accused room to perform innocence in the exact tone the world expects from a respectable professional. But cases like this don't survive on performance alone. They survive on whether evidence can be made to lie, and evidence is stubborn. Investigators pulled the thread through relationships, through timelines, through phone calls and contact patterns, through the way an affair doesn't just create romance. It creates pressure. Pressure to leave. Pressure to choose. Pressure to end what is in the way. And when that pressure builds, it tends to produce the same outcome in these stories. A person begins to treat another person's life as negotiable. The courtroom phase became an autopsy of obsession. Not simply did she do it, but how far did her mind travel before her body followed? The state's narrative pushed the idea of a calculated act fueled by jealousy and the need to win, the need to replace, the need to take the spouse's seat at the table by removing the spouse entirely. The defense pushed back with alternative explanations, with doubt, with the argument that suspicion is not proof. But the jury's conclusion was the hard ending the public craves in a story that feels morally contaminated, guilty. And the reason this case belongs as the final entry in a top 10 about teachers who kill is not because it is the most gruesome. It's because it is the cleanest demonstration of how a trusted role can sit beside an untrusted soul. A teacher's job is to guide children through right and wrong. Warmus' case became infamous because it suggested a person can teach the language of rules while privately deciding rules don't apply when desire is strong enough. The aftermath is the same bitter residue this whole list leaves behind. Not only a dead woman and a shattered family, but a community forced to look at teacher as a title that grants access, not a title that guarantees character. And that is the last note this documentary ends on. The most disturbing killers don't always look like danger. Sometimes they look like the person who smiles at your child in a hallway, and you smile back without thinking twice.